A big welcome to everyone. I know we have a huge group of Hamilton, Kirkland alumni, Hamilton current students, a number of current parents, and a special welcome to more than 50 accepted students who are joining us for tonight's conversation with Phil Klinkner. Many of us in this conversation know Phil really well, but for those of you who don't, I'll give you a little bit of a background on him. And Phil, I'm glad you're muted in this moment. So Professor Klinkner is the James Sherman Associate Professor of Government. He's an expert in American politics, including parties and elections, race relations, Congress, and the presidency. So you might imagine Phil is as popular as ever as a speaker these days. He's taught courses along the lines of political parties and elections, political oratory, Congress and legislative politics, American political development, and American political process. At Hamilton, he's been the director of the Arthur Levitt Public Affairs Center, and he's also served as the chair of the government department for more years than I can even count. And by the way, he joined Hamilton in 1995. He is one of the most popular faculty members on campus, not only because of his accessibility of material in the classroom, but also because of his accessibility and participation in all things Hamilton. He is beloved, both on and off the Hill, and a fun fact, here we go, Phil. He has more than 8,000 followers on Twitter. So if you're not following him, now's the moment. And he and his wife, Andrea, are avid karaoke fans. That's your trivia. And with that, I turn it over to Phil to entertain us for the next hour or so. Thanks, Phil, for doing this with us.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
We need to unmute him.
Yep. All right. Can everybody hear me? Everything's okay, Nancy?
It's very soft. Can you be louder?
Yeah, I can be louder. All right. I can be pretty loud, as you guys know. So Lori, thank you for that great introduction, and thanks to Nancy and Sharon and everybody at the advancement office who set this up. As you all know, I think it's really important for all of us to be reaching out with family and friends, and Hamilton is certainly a community of friends and supporters. So I'm really happy to do this, and I'm especially happy to reach out and communicate with the prospective students.
Phil,
yeah.
sorry, we're having a request. You need to be even louder. It's kind of hard to hear you.
I'm going to kick out of this. Hold on.
Oh, much better.
Better. Okay, those are just cheap microphone. Okay, I was just thanking everybody for joining in and thanking everybody for coming out tonight. I just wanted to sort of take this opportunity to talk a little bit about what I think is going on in our politics and whether or not this pandemic, this crisis moment has changed our politics, if at all. And I thought I would discuss some short-term impacts that I think that have been there, or some possible short-term impacts, and then the longer term, what might this do to our politics? And I think a couple things have happened in the short term that suggest some change in our politics. I think to everybody's surprise, Congress has actually acted pretty quickly and pretty decisively in the midst of this crisis. And obviously, they can always move faster, they can always move more decisively. But if 2 months ago you had said, you know, there's going to be some national crisis and Congress is going to act within a matter of days to spend a couple $1 trillion to try and meet this crisis, you would have thought I was insane. But in fact, that's what's happened. And there's been the usual sort of partisan wrangling, but I at least am pretty impressed at how quickly Congress has acted in a really bipartisan fashion. Those votes really sort of sailed through. I think there's some things about the current political alignment that made that more likely to happen, and if that alignment had been different, but I can talk about that another time. The other thing that's happened in the short term is we saw a little bit of an approval bounce for President Trump. And President Trump, over the roughly 3+ years that he's been in office, has had a very stable approval rating, very little change in that. And you actually saw him get a little bit of a bounce. And this is really to be expected. Political scientists for years have noticed and talked about what they call the rally around the flag effect. That in times of national crisis, presidents, prime ministers, and not just the United States, often see a boost in their approval rating. Largely because they have the bully pulpit. They're sort of very visible in this moment of crisis. People look to them for leadership. There aren't a lot of contradictory voices, at least at the time, and they can often get a approval bounce, but it's often very short term. On the other hand, just talking about why some of these short-term effects really maybe not all that important, Trump's approval rating bounce was really pretty small, on the order of about 5 points, and it's fallen back now. And this is in comparison to, say, other world leaders who've seen much larger approval bounces on the order of 10, even 20 points. We've also seen this with a number of governors in the United States. A number of governors are suddenly much more popular than they were a couple of weeks ago. Somebody I know was asking how come Democrats didn't nominate Andrew Cuomo for president, and I pointed out that 3 weeks ago everybody hated Andrew Cuomo. But nonetheless, in a moment of crisis, people have sort of responded, and he's gotten a very large approval bounce. We'll see how long that maintains itself, but nonetheless it's happened. But that's in contrast to Trump, who got a very small bounce and went away very quickly. The other thing that suggests that we really haven't seen much change because of the pandemic is that in the head-to-head races for the presidency between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, they've been pretty stable. They really haven't bounced around very much, even though Trump got an approval bounce. It didn't seem to have much, if any, impact on the presidential race. And it suggests that people were able to sort of separate out their thoughts about Trump, at least at that moment, and also how they felt about the presidential election. Other than that, it does suggest in the short term not much has changed. There's no evidence of any strong impact on the presidential race. Like I said, Joe Biden seems to have a small but relatively durable lead in the polls against Donald Trump. That's been true for a number of months. We'll see if it remains true as we go into the summer and the fall. But that's been pretty consistent over the last few months, and there hasn't been anything in the last month or so that really seems to have changed people's vote intention. Again, we'll see what happens. In terms of the long term, I think one question a lot of people have, and they've had this question for a number of years, really, but with greater urgency now is this going to be the moment that sort of breaks the fever in our politics? Maybe a bad metaphor for right now. Sorry about that. Will this be the kumbaya moment in which Americans will find a way to get past the partisan polarization, the division that has really characterized American politics for the last 20 years? And as much as I'd like to be an optimist about this, I'd have to say it's pretty doubtful. Partisan lenses are very powerful. Partisanship has become people's sort of major identity now in America. It supersedes their career, it supersedes their education. In many cases, it supersedes religion. It supersedes family in some cases, that your partisan identity has become more important than any other identity that you might have. And like I said, these partisan lenses are very powerful. And as a result, each side seems to be interpreting this crisis in ways that reinforce their prior beliefs. Democrats have responded to this with what you would expect Democrats to respond to it with. They've called for universal health care. They called for a stronger safety net. They called for stronger government capacity. Republicans, on the other hand, have essentially done the things that you would expect of them. They've talked about foreign policies and trade policies that put America first. They've been very likely to blame China, foreign governments, for the pandemic. They've denounced increasingly so what they see as government overreach in these stay-at-home orders, even the point of saying that this is a massive attempt at repression of individual rights. They talked about privatizing the post office and so on. I really haven't seen a lot that suggests that Democrats and Republicans are, in response to this crisis, looking at the world in very different ways. There have been, and again, the response of, say, Republican versus Democratic governors, with some notable examples, has been that Republican governors have been much less likely to respond quickly, to respond in very strong ways in terms of stay-at-home orders. Democrats have been much more likely to move very quickly. I think the other thing that suggests that this isn't going to be a sort of moment of togetherness is that it doesn't help that the biggest impact of these cases and deaths has been in largely blue areas. There's exceptions to that, but nonetheless, the most hard-hit areas, the places with the largest number of cases, the largest number of deaths, have been largely in blue areas, largely in cities, places like New York, New Jersey, Atlanta, Detroit, Chicago, Seattle, places like that. Rural areas and states, for the most part, and again, there have been exceptions and hotspots in different places, have just not seen the impact that we've seen in major cities. The other thing, sorry, somebody's doing a leaf blower out here. Hopefully you guys can all still hear me. Otherwise I can throw the headphones on. Can you guys hear me okay with that leaf blower in the background? Sorry, this is the dangers of remote
yeah, we can hear you fine. It's great.
Okay.
It's much better than it was before.
All right. So the other thing that doesn't give me hope that this is going to change much is Trump is still being Trump. And whether you love him or hate him, you really have not seen any change in who he is. You have not seen Trump attempting to do what most national leaders do in moments like this, is to play the apolitical national leader, to rise above partisan politics, to try and be a comforting, empathetic figure. I think a good comparison here is Boris Johnson in Great Britain, who also was very controversial, very deeply divisive, who really in this moment, again, we'll see how long it lasts, has attempted to be that apolitical national leader, to try and reach out. If you saw the little video speech that he gave a couple days ago when he got out of the hospital, he was extolling the virtues of the National Health Service and praising the people who'd worked with him, and talking about how this was going to be a moment that was going to make the United Kingdom a better and stronger place. For those of you who can sort of do some deep cuts on British politics, he had a statement earlier before he went in the hospital where he talked about this proves that there really is such a thing as a society. And if some of us are old enough to remember when Margaret Thatcher famously said, there's no such thing as society. All there are individuals and families. And she used that as a reason why that government should play less of a role. That the primary units in any nation were individuals and families, and that should be the primary source of support rather than a societal community that was responsible for one another. So it really did strike many observers of British politics when Boris Johnson said there really is such a thing as society. It was seen as here a conservative, a Tory leader really sort of repudiating Margaret Thatcher. So I would say that, to paraphrase somewhat, a crisis, somebody once said a crisis doesn't transform character, it reveals it. And I think this is likely true with our politics. This pandemic likely won't transform our politics, but rather it seems likely to heighten and sharpen those politics. The final note I'll have here is just on the presidential race. I mentioned a little bit about it. It doesn't seem to have really changed what we're seeing in the polling for the presidential race. I think that's likely to remain because, as I suggested, partisanship is very strong. And there hasn't been anything yet that seems to be uprooting those partisan tendencies. If anything, they seem to be reinforcing them. So I don't think this is going to sort of shake up the presidential race in a significant way, in that people are going to say, oh my gosh, Trump just totally bungled this. We've got to vote him out of office. Or people are going to say, you know, oh, Democrats are going to use this opportunity to put in place a stronger welfare state, so we've got to be for Trump and stuff like that. I think people are pretty stable in their preferences right now. The one wild card here is the state of the economy. And for political scientists who model elections, who look at approval ratings, who look at the state of the economy, the timing of this crisis really could not have been worse for President Trump. Most of those models of economic fundamentals point to the crucial time being the first and the second quarter of the election year. And that's exactly where we are now. We just finished the first quarter. We're now into the second quarter. And generally what those models say is if you get an economic dip in those quarters, that it is often very, very bad for an incumbent president or an incumbent party. And we're seeing that right now. The question is, will people, and I think people are inclined to see this as a temporary kind of thing, if it is. So if it is temporary, if some point by the end of the summer, fall, the economy is back, things are moving in the right direction, I think the lasting sort of impact on Trump's chances won't be that strong. But the real question here is, can the economy really begin to reopen without new outbreaks? There's some talk of reopening the economy, but if we have to do this again in a month or 2 months or 3 or 4 or whatever, or if we open up again, close down again, open up again, and so on, that's going to be very bad for the economy. The other question is whether or not the economic impacts of this are going to be temporary, if we can get back to normal, or even if we get back to normal, that this did some really lasting damage to the economy. And sort of related to that is what's the impact on the rest of the world? And even if the United States can get back to some semblance of normality, will the rest of the world be able to, and what kind of economic drag is that going to have? And whether or not this is going to be something that we are going to be mending in a couple of months, or if this is going to take years. And I think that's the real wild card in the presidential race. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. And the questions, rather than sort of shouting them out, I think you've been asked to send them in the chat. And then am I going to read them, Nancy, or one of you want to read them so everybody can get it?
We'll read them. We'll feed you the questions.
Okay.
We don't see any in the chat yet, so if anyone has a burning one, go for it.
Well, I see one to me, and it's private. I won't say who gave it, but is Boris Johnson's change in tone a function of the fact that he got COVID himself? May well be, although I would say Johnson has been moving in this direction to some extent. He, in the last election, sounded, as the Brits would say, surprisingly squishy about the welfare state. And he seems to be wanting to try and create a new kind of coalition in Britain, which has a sort of basis in the working class, although traditionally that's been the great support of the Labour Party. We've seen a kind of flipping of the class coalitions there. And he recognizes that these people are very much attached to the British welfare state, particularly the National Health Service. And so we saw a little bit of the change in tone there. And even before Johnson got sick, he was sort of making noises in that direction. So I think it's obviously he seems to be sincerely moved by what kind of care he got at the NHS, but I think it preceded that. So Nancy, I'll let you do the next question.
Maria Zamet, you had your hand up. I'm trying. Go ahead now.
Maria.
I think I'm so, oh, there we go. Yeah, I had a question that's related to the election, but it's more in the sense of possible presidential, here's what I'm worried about, presidential overreach and the way there seems to be a hollowing out of institutions and a breakdown in checks and balances. Because from my perspective, it seems like you have a Senate that is very accommodating, at least the Republicans, very accommodating to Trump. And then with the Supreme Court, with the makeup of the court, they seem to be more accommodating as well. So how do you think, and there is that worry that he's said all these statements, which sometimes Trump has, that he's walked back from, but like, I can tell the governors what to do, and then he's walked back from it. But he seems to think he has these unbelievable powers to do whatever he wants. And that really worries me coming up to November. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Crises are always a moment for expansion of executive power. Presidents, whether it's war or economic crises, usually ask for and get expanded powers. And you see this at the gubernatorial level. Just governors are essentially shutting down businesses because of public health emergencies. And they really, with very few exceptions, have been backed up by the courts. and have gotten very little pushback from the legislatures. We'll see how long that lasts. We saw this protest in Michigan yesterday of people saying we're tired of the shutdown order. We're starting to see legislators, primarily Republican legislators in fairly conservative red states, are beginning to push back against these shutdown orders. We're seeing more of governors in some of these states saying that we want to get things reopened. You know, the question is how long they can sort of hold on to these powers. You know, in some countries, you know, for example, in Hungary, they essentially use this as an opportunity just to kind of bring the clamps down even more. I think in general, Democrats, if anything, have been asking for Trump to more power over the last couple of weeks and months, saying you need to invoke the War Production Act. You need to, you know, be a stronger leader. You need to lean on states that have been more recalcitrant in putting in place stay-at-home orders and things like that. You know, again, the question is, what's it going to look like on the other side of the crisis? But definitely, crises have been a moment for executives to take power, and often they take power and never give it up.
Phil.
Yeah.
We have Richard Skinner.
Oh yeah. Hey, Richard.
Richard, do you want to ask your question? I'm finding it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
What are the chances that Congress adopts remote voting?
Looking better today. You just saw Jim McGovern of the Rules Committee put forward. I didn't read it carefully, but put forward a proposal to do some form of proxy voting kind of thing. I think, you know, we actually had a great session this afternoon. George Baker and Frank Vlasic, both Hamilton alums, did a session for our students and talked about sort of lobbying in a time of pandemic. And they talked about all the reasons why that's a difficult sort of thing, that Congress really does see itself as this working body where people get together and act and talk and discourse with one another. And if we go to remote voting, a big part of how Congress operates would really be changed. My guess is that you may see some moves in that direction, but it'll be pretty temporary. I don't think we're going to move to a situation where they're just going to allow remote voting for a snowstorm, or if somebody's home with, you know, daycare or whatever. They're probably not going to do that. I think they're going to move very slowly to that. And that's been pretty bipartisan. Both Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell have been very wary of moving to any form of remote voting.
Okay, thank you. Next on the chat, a question from Lucy Naughton. Is there any way to predict when the federal government and individual states will reopen?
Yeah.
No idea. You know, I'm not an epidemiologist. I mean, to me, what's interesting is the politics of it. And we saw politics of when states shut down, that Republican governors, in part because they represent more rural areas where they had fewer, if any, cases, were less likely to shut down. And then you had these 8 states, which were sort of laggards, that didn't actually issue a full-on, you know, stay-at-home order. And what we're seeing now is that a number of Republican governors are, and Republican legislators in a number of states are calling for quicker reopening. And we're seeing these sort of compacts of states where the states are working together, but primarily Democratic states. So Wisconsin, Illinois, you did have a Republican in Ohio, Kentucky, Democratic governor, are trying to coordinate when we do this, because it doesn't make any sense for, say, Ohio, which is governed by Mike DeWine, a Republican, who I should say, you know, is a pretty conservative Republican, but nonetheless has really been very proactive on this. It doesn't make any sense for Ohio to reopen when Kentucky isn't, and people, you know, are just driving across the border. It would create all sorts of problems and would really kind of undo what states are trying to do in these cases. And then there's a sort of West Coast model of this, which again is sort of a largely Democratic thing of the coastal states. We'll see if we get some more of these kind of compacts. But in many ways, I think this is kind of a breakdown of federal responsibility. States often can make bad choices. We talk about laboratories of democracy, and I think that's generally a good thing. But if it's a case where a state reopening in a hasty, haphazard way could do it and really invite a rebound on this, which would be damaging not only to that state, but to the states around it and people around the country. So.
Okay, I'm just going right down the chat here. Carl Koster wonders, do you think a nationalized healthcare system would have helped the US during this pandemic?
It's hard to say. The United States, there doesn't seem to be much difference in terms of how bad the situation got based on what kind of healthcare system you had. It's not clear what's going on there. There seems to be a big variation between countries in how many cases they got, how quickly those cases accelerated, how quickly they decelerated, how many deaths were associated with it. And just from eyeballing it, I haven't been able to see anything that says that a country with universal healthcare did much better. Some places had universal healthcare, but there's a lot of confounding factors. Sweden has famously a very strong universal healthcare system. On the other hand, they didn't put in place rigid social controls until much later. And so, I think largely the case about healthcare that I can see so far is largely a sort of moral, ideological case. I haven't seen any evidence from this that says that if you had a universal healthcare system in this country, it would have made a huge difference. That said, there are a large number of individuals out there now who do not have health insurance because they've lost their jobs. I'm sure there are people out there who have not gone to treatment because they know they can't pay for it, and that probably has made things worse. But I can't, at a sort of systemic level say if we had universal health care that this would be wildly different. I just don't know.
Okay, Ann Dubin's next. Ann, I'm unmuting you.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Phil.
Hey, Ann, how you doing?
I'm just doing peachy. First of all, I want to congratulate all of the accepted students who are on the call, and I hope that you will matriculate, and I hope that you will take a class with Phil, and I hope that 16 years after doing so, you'll do a Zoom karaoke session with him, as I did a couple of weeks ago. So Phil, my question is about how, well, first of all, whether, because that's not necessarily, it's not necessarily going to happen at all, but whether and how COVID might affect the immigration debate, because if anything, it's thrown into sharp relief how much we all depend on undocumented folks for growing our food, harvesting our food, cooking our food, delivering our food, all of the supply chain stuff. I don't think that it would ever affect GOP orthodoxy on immigration, but is there a chance that public opinion could move as a result of this?
Public opinion on immigration has been moving over the last decade, really, and it's been moving in a more liberal direction. It's just that those who've been opposed to a more liberal immigration policy have become, that's become their number one issue, and the primary thing that they're voting on, one of the primary things that they're voting on. My guess is that, like the other things, people are going to look at this moment and they're going to interpret it in very different ways. If people were inclined to think negatively about immigration in the United States, whether documented or undocumented, they're going to continue and they're going to pull things out from this moment to say, this is why we got to cut off immigration and so on. People who are more inclined to think well of immigrants, documented or undocumented, are going to use this, like, you've done very eloquently, pointing out that undocumented and documented immigrants do these jobs which we now know are the essential jobs, cleaning hospitals, working in grocery stores, growing food, things like that. So I think that, it's probably just going to heighten and, like I said, heighten and sharpen this debate. Certainly the Trump administration has used this moment to even further clamp down on asylum seekers and things like that, and has rhetorically talked about the need for America to, America first, to maintain our borders and things like that.
Great.
Next question.
Thank you. From
Thanks, Phil.
Sonia, for Sonia, who should be unmuted now.
Yes. Hi, Professor Klinkner. Thank you so much
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. So my question is, so just today, the news reported that scientists believe or estimating that if the country was shut down 2 weeks prior to when it actually was shut down, if it had been shut down March 2nd instead of March 16th, that 90% of the lives they believe will be lost by mid-July. So they're estimating 60,000 people will die from this by mid-July, but 90% of those people would not die by mid-July, would not have died or will die by mid-July. So they could have saved 90%. So there would only be a mortality rate of 6,000 people instead of 60,000 people by mid-July. So that's the estimate that I read today. Do you believe that that figure, that those numbers will have an effect on Mr. Trump's reelection in November? And that the fact that there was a monumental failure on the part of, a documented monumental failure on the part of this administration to, raise red flags and alert the public to the presence of this virus, and to do anything about it.
Yeah.
In a timely way.
Yeah, I think you're already getting two competing narratives about what happened, and as you pointed out, Democrats are saying the Trump administration moved too slowly. They denied all of this for weeks, months, even though they had a number of red flags and things like that. That's one narrative, and we're definitely going to hear more about that narrative up through November. The other narrative we're hearing from the Trump administration is that we shut down flights from China, very quickly when people said that we shouldn't do that. We actually acted very quickly. This is all the Obama administration's fault, and so on. And when you've got those competing narratives, people will pick and choose the narrative that most reinforces which way they're already inclined. And like I said, I think reinforcing this is that the places where this has struck the hardest have been areas which are already primarily Democratic. And that in Republican areas, whether because of population density or other things, have not and again, I don't want to minimize any tragedies in those areas, but have largely seen more, have not seen as significant of cases and deaths and things like that. And I think that just reinforces this. So like I said, I think, people pick the narrative that reinforces which way they believe. And that's one narrative. And, people may accept that, but I think they're more inclined to just sort of go with what they were thinking before.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Edwige?
Oh, hi.
Hi, Vij.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay. How are you? So my question is, our politics have gotten so polarized that it would seem to me in this cycle where before it's like, is Biden going to pick a woman? Is he going to pick a person of color? And it seems to me, at least when it comes to the Democrats, you're either for Trump or against. There's really no place to go. So what is your thought? Do you think the candidate, whether it's Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, or even Stacey Abrams in Georgia, do you think it's a cycle where it really doesn't matter who he picks?
Well, if you ask political scientists, they would say that it doesn't matter who you pick as your vice president, and Sarah Palin's the exception that proves the rule. That essentially it's do no harm. As long as you pick a sort of generic political figure, it's not going to hurt you. But it's not going to help you much either. And you can talk about maybe little effects in a state level.
He kind of did promise that he would,
he did
nominate
say
a woman, and I don't know what, whether he would get any kind of bump or more.
There doesn't seem to be any evidence that picking a woman as a vice presidential candidate really helped. Sarah Palin did not really change the gender dynamics in 2008, and certainly Geraldine Ferraro in 1984 didn't really change it. I think that's more a way of maybe exciting the Democratic base a little bit more, and sort of more kind of internal party maintenance than it is about sort of changing things in the general election. The one thing I would say about VP picks, and we'll be hearing a lot about this, and like you said, is he considering Kamala Harris? Is he considering Elizabeth Warren? One thing I'd say is that VP picks are like icebergs. 70% or more of what's going on is below the surface. There's a vetting process now, and they're going to be very rigorously examining each of these vice presidential prospects. Sorry for the crudeness. Somebody once who went through the process described it as going through a colonoscopy without anesthesia. And they're not going to come out there and say, oh, we didn't pick candidate X because we found out that they had some shady real estate deals, right? They're just going to pick somebody else. We don't know why somebody doesn't get picked. And so somebody who might seem like a really obvious choice and the best choice for VP pick may, if we had access to all the information, would have been a disastrous choice, right? And we know this from the past. We know that, the reason Sarah Palin got picked was they didn't do a vetting process. We can go back all the way to George McGovern in 1972, picking Tom Eagleton on the fly. There was no vetting process there. And they do this vetting in order to avoid those sort of damaging picks. So there's going to be a lot of talk about this, but all of the really important stuff is going to be happening behind the scenes, and something will be announced, and maybe it'll be seen as a good choice, maybe it'll be seen as a bad choice, but we don't know what were all the factors and conditions that went into making that choice as opposed to some other person.
Yeah.
Great. Kevin McGowan.
Yes, thank you. Professor Klinkner, I just have a question about the election day process.
Sure.
And we've seen last week all the events in Wisconsin. And I was just wondering if this virus and everything it highlights may move more states toward mail-in voting and absentee voting, which is already obviously going on. Mm-hmm. Or might just, and I know the federal government plays a role in this too, and maybe you could illuminate that, federal government versus the states when federal offices are at stake. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering both what the impact on our upcoming November election, and then maybe a broader thing into the future. Is this going to change our election day norms and the way we usually have considered voting as a one-day process into mm-hmm. something more expansive or different?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think, like so many things I've talked about, we've been moving in opposite directions for a long time, and this is going to accelerate that. And what we've seen in a number of states, primarily led by Democrats, is that they've made voting easier. They've expanded early voting. They've made it easier to register. They've made it easy to get absentee ballots, or they've instituted mail-in ballots and things like that. I know Patty McGuire's on here somewhere, and he's a county clerk in Washington, where everything is done by mail. And I think going towards November, you're going to see a number of primarily Democratic states who are going to expand access to vote by mail and making, say, no-fault absentee balloting much easier. On the other hand, you have a number of states largely led by Republicans, which have been cracking down on voting and making it tougher, needing photo IDs, limiting early voting, limiting access to absentee ballots, and things like that. And I think they're probably going to move in that direction. And we saw what happened in Wisconsin. Democratic governor wanted to delay the primary for safety and health reasons. Republicans in the legislature and Republican in the state courts and the federal courts said, nope, got to go ahead with it. Now, it may give Republicans a little bit of pause because it didn't seem to have the outcome that they wanted, which was Democrats looked like there was kind of a backlash. Democrats were pretty enraged about this. So they said, all right, we'll go out, we'll stand in the sleet and the rain for a couple hours. Turnout was up in a number of places. Requests for absentee ballots were up. And Democrats actually won a state Supreme Court seat in Wisconsin by Wisconsin standards, a pretty sizable margin. When in fact, just a year ago, it was a very different outcome. So like I think the role for the federal government largely is making resources available to states who want to move to mail-in voting. And a number of Democrats have talked about putting money into any further stimulus or economic relief bills to make it easier for states to do that. So far, Republicans have said they don't want to do it. You've heard President Trump saying, no, we absolutely can't have mail-in voting. That'd be a terrible idea. So I think I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen. But again, putting in place those mechanisms, especially this quickly, would be very expensive. And without the federal government putting up the money, it's going to be a lot harder for states who want to move in that direction. The one wild card is what the courts are going to say about this. And again, we don't know what the sort of situation on the ground is going to be in November. But if it is a case where, there are stay-at-home orders and things like that, are courts going to allow delays in voting? Are courts going to overturn existing laws regarding access to absentee ballots in order to allow people to vote in a state of an emergency? Or are they going to say, no, if you're going to vote, you got to do it the same way as before? I'm just not sure how the courts are going to interpret that going forward. Okay.
Caroline Moore.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Caroline.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier that Democrats were advocating for certainly more changes to the safety net and the healthcare system than Republicans are, but I feel like especially on the state level, the changes they've been pushing for are small, like extensions to COBRA, changes to like what foods you can buy under WIC, and not really strong like left-wing policy changes. So I was wondering if you think that's like purely political maneuvering, or if you think that the Democratic Party is at its core sort of centrist party and it's rejecting its left-wing contingent, like because that's the goal.
Well, I think there are two things there. One is sort of where does the Democratic Party stand in normal times on issues like, say, Medicare for all? And the other is, what is the sort of pragmatic position to take in this very moment of crisis? And I think that Democrats in this moment of crisis are thinking very carefully about what can we extract right now. And they're trying to be very hard-headed about making sure that whatever Congress appropriates, that it is, let's maximize the benefit that's going to the people that we see as our constituents and the people who need it the most. So they focus on things like unemployment insurance and stuff like that. And my guess is that Nancy Pelosi, among many others, and people who maybe in more normal moments would be very strong advocates of Medicare for all, would say, that ain't going to happen now. And we're not going to give up, say, smaller, more marginal benefits, but nonetheless are things that people really need right now. And we're going to put that fight off for another couple of months or whenever. Going forward, I think the Democratic Party is moving, and they've moved to the left very much just in the last decade on this issue of Medicare for all. Joe Biden's been moving. He's talked about lowering the age of Medicare accessibility. The Democratic Party is, still a pretty heterogeneous tent. And you have a number of people there, so on the one hand, you got people like AOC who represent very, very liberal districts, but you also have people like Anthony Brindisi, who's a Democrat who represents upstate New York, where Hamilton College is. But that's a district that Trump won by 13 points. Democrats need to find a way forward that brings all of them on board, or almost all of them. And my guess is that, you can accuse Nancy Pelosi of being many things, but she's not naive when it comes to counting votes. And my guess is Nancy Pelosi's counting the votes for Medicare for all and saying, this probably doesn't even, gets a bare majority in my own caucus. And therefore, why do I want to try and push for something that is going to split my own caucus and is going to be defeated on the floor? That said, the Democratic Party has been moving to the left on that issue. And in a decade from now, you might see Democrats much more unified on this issue, and so on. My guess is that if Democrats win the White House, manage to get control of the Senate, you're going to see some marginal changes moving in the direction of universal health care. But I think it's very unlikely that you're going to see them advocate a Medicare for all plan. So.
Okay, Jack O'Hare.
I got my keep calm, carry on. I think it's flipped around, but.
Yes. So, yes. Let's see here. I'm trying to find it up in the chat. Let's see here.
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem at all. Video's just off.
Okay.
But let's see here. Oh my goodness. Here we go. All right. Let's see. So, what is your perspective on the emergence of a more unified left wing of the Democratic Party, and how will this split affect the general election in the form of protest votes or leaving the party?
Mm-hmm.
And let's see. In other words, what will the rejection of the left by the Democratic Party aid in the possible ascension of a third party or play a major part in the scope of American politics moving forward?
You know, political scientists usually are pretty down on the chances of third parties to really make a big impact in American politics. We haven't had a sort of third party that became a major party since the Republicans came back in the 1850s. And the reason for that is there are just a number of structural factors that make it very, very difficult for third parties to get any traction. Namely that we have single member winner-take-all districts. Only one person can win a House seat. Only one person can win a governor's race. Only one person can win a Senate race. Only one person can be elected president. We don't have proportional representation where even if your party only gets 20% of the vote, you get 20% or somewhere thereabouts of the seats. That's a huge dampening effect on the ability of third parties to emerge. Third parties could emerge. They, in a very close election, can have an impact. Who knows if that's going to happen? Third parties probably hurt Hillary Clinton's chances in 2016. But if anything, I think third parties will probably have a less of an impact in this election than in 2016. There will be some number of Bernie supporters, left-wing sorts in the Democratic Party who are going to essentially sit this one out. It doesn't seem like there's really anybody out there that's going to get much support. Maybe it'll go to the Green Party, things like that. But a number of sort of people who were once Green Party supporters, rejected Hillary Clinton in 2016, have been pretty, strong in saying, no, we've got to defeat Trump this time around. On the right, Justin Amash of Michigan, he was a very conservative libertarian Republican, left the party last year because he was so alienated from Trump. He says he's going to run on a third party ticket. That might create some space for disaffected Republicans who don't want to vote for Trump, but maybe are looking for some place other than voting for a Democrat. But my guess is that the percentage of the vote going to third-party candidates this election will probably be lower than it was in 2016. But again, in a close election, it could make a difference, but you just don't necessarily know how that's going to play out in terms of who that advantages. So.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Allison Brown, and the answer to your question is absolutely whatever you'd like.
Hi. So
what was the question?
The question was, can she change questions?
Oh, all right.
I live in Tennessee, so I originally had a question about like rural states that didn't expand Medicaid. Yeah. But then I was wondering, we all know it's census year. We've all seen the commercials like, you're stuck at home anyway, do your census.
Right.
Can you, and it was just so interesting to me that this hit literally as the census was being rolled out. Can you talk about if you think COVID will affect not only the census, but possibly redistricting on the congressional and also like the state and local level?
Yeah, obviously the census is what we use to determine population for congressional redistricting. I don't know what kind of results they're getting back. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not. But if I was a demographer working for the Census Bureau, I would be extremely worried. And I'm sure they are doing a number of surveys and things like that, try and see what kind of accuracy they're getting. And, you know, it seems to me that this crisis has exacerbated the problem that already existed in the census, which was the census was really good at picking up highly educated people who are socially trusting, who get a form in the mail from the government and sort of like, oh yeah, I can fill that up or whatever. And it's not so good at picking up people who are economically marginal, who are not so trusting of the government for various reasons, who maybe don't have a fixed address and things like that. And that's been the big problem with the census over the last couple of decades, that it's miscounting people primarily in urban areas, primarily in areas with a lot of immigrants, principally Latino immigrants, but also others. And that this crisis is just going to exacerbate that skew in sort of who responds to the census. And we've seen kind of census politics over the last couple of decades where Democrats have said, you know, we got these problems with doing an actual count of the census. We think we should supplement it with sampling. You know, I'm a social scientist, so I'm pretty strong believer in the ability of using sampling in ways that can be very stable and robust and accurate. But Republicans said, no, census says you got to do an actual count. Now, it just so happens that the people who would probably be counted using sampling and other more sort of rigorous methods of census taking would probably be more likely to be in Democratic areas, probably more likely to vote for Democrats, and Republicans don't want to see that. So, yeah, I think we're probably going to have a big battle over the census. And Democrats are going to say, no, these are unreliable results. Republicans are going to say, no, sorry, you know, census has to be done X way. We really got to move on, and so on. And we, you know, nothing, yeah, you know, 100 years ago in the 1920s, you know, since we're all looking back to 1918, basically they didn't redistrict Congress for a decade because they didn't like the results. It counted too many people in cities and they didn't want to redistrict. So we'll see what happens. Now, again, you know, if Democrats get control of you know, both houses and the White House, you might see something very different in January. Yeah, good question.
I see Richard Skinner waving.
Yeah,
so I can't ignore
you. I just wanted to comment. Excuse me?
You still working on the census?
I am working at the census. That's why I wanted to comment. And first of all, any comments I make are my own opinion and do not reflect the views of the Census Bureau. But yes, we're out. These are challenging times for the census in a lot of ways. Normally, the process for the census is, you know, we reach out to people at their address. Used to be just by mail. This time we're doing it online, mail. People can respond by phone. And then we do what is called the non-response follow-up, which is sort of the old-fashioned census taker at your door. And as Phil indicated, that tends to be aimed particularly at the groups that we see as low response. We have particular areas that we target, and they do indeed tend to be areas with lots of immigrants, with lots of renters, where people tend to be more transient.
Yep.
And right now, that's being postponed by a couple of months. The Bureau put out a statement this week with kind of a new schedule for the census, and I won't bore you with all the different ways that we count people because not everybody lives in what we call a housing unit, a house or apartment. Some people live in nursing homes or in college dorms or whatever. But all of those are being postponed. And then the Bureau can do that in-house, move all these deadlines in-house.
Yeah.
But what they then said is that moving these deadlines means that we cannot fulfill the traditional obligation, which is to give the census results to the president at the end of the year, and then give it to the states for redistricting a couple months later. So they're now asking Congress to delay those deadlines because those are legal deadlines, not in-house deadlines, legal deadlines to sometime in 2021. I think the presidential deadline would be April, and that the state deadline would be in the summer. Now, there are a lot of moving parts here. For one thing, a lot of states have all kinds of legal requirements regarding redistricting, and moving a deadline from February into next summer means that it messes with a lot of those deadlines. So I think some states will have to take some kind of action to account for that shift in.
Yeah, you died out there. The one thing I would add on this is that two things. One, we know that states can do redistricting very quickly if they have to, really in a matter of months, so they can do this. So there's nothing that says that these deadlines have to be fixed. The other thing is that Republicans do have a vested interest in doing the census because they're expecting to get a bonus out of this. States like New York, even California, are going to lose some seats in Democratic areas and probably go to states which are Republican. So even if it doesn't have a big impact in, say, 2022 in the redistricting for the House, it'll have an impact in the Electoral College for 2024. So Republicans have an incentive in making sure that this gets done at some point.
I'm going to step in here to say sure. We've got 3 more questions lined up, but we have so many more people who have questions for you, Phil. All right. We're going to save the chat, and we're going to ask that maybe you get back to people on their questions.
Sure.
So we're giving you homework.
I'll do the best I can.
Awesome. Max Schneidman.
Max.
Hi. So this is the one thing I'll quickly observe on the census question. The Clinton administration back in the late 90s wanted to try sampling for the census, and the Supreme Court actually shot it down 5-4. So that's just one thing, because sampling would be better than pure counting. That's just statistical knowledge. Anyway, the question actually relates to the long-term impact of the virus, in that this is going to be the second once-in-a-generation economic shock that the millennials and the Gen Z, the Zoomers, are going to be facing. How do you see that affecting generational politics? I mean, the closest comparison we probably have is what happened to the Depression era generation.
Yeah, who knows? I think the question is how long is this lasting? Is this something that is extraordinarily painful but is largely over in, say, a couple of months or even a year? Or is this something that really, like I said, does some lasting damage to the economy, and it's going to go on for a period of time? We don't know yet. So the worst case scenarios, we just have rolling outbreaks, constant opening, closing in the economy, stuff like that, or a prolonged shutdown in a number of places. That could have some really long-lasting economic damage. In terms of the generational politics of it, it's. I think it more so than a generational impact. It's what we've seen out of this is a class impact. That if you are in a job where you do not physically be there, you're essentially a symbolic worker, like a college professor or word processor, things like that. People are finding that they don't need to be in work, and that they can sort of maintain a job in these types of environments. But people who are working in the retail sector, the service sector, things like that, this has just been devastating. And we just don't know how bad the impact of this is going to be on those sectors, retail, restaurants, things like that. And, especially if it's prolonged, even if it's short term, what's the impact going to be? So I think that if anything, I'm sensing that the impact is probably more about class than it's about, say, generational politics. Okay. What was the next question, Nancy?
From Alexander Catamaris.
Sure.
Hi. So my question is, has the pandemic escalated class conflict due to lower socioeconomic classes being disproportionately affected by COVID-19? And will this energize those in the lower socioeconomic classes to vote more frequently?
We'll see. I don't know. And again, we're it seems like a decade has gone by in the last month, but we're, essentially a month into this. We don't know. But clearly, just looking at, the zip codes that are affected by this, the people who are affected by it, it definitely has a sort of class component to it. Whether or not that gets translated into political action remains to be seen. There's been some efforts at of workers in, say, warehouses and delivery services to unionize. Again, we'll see how effective that's going to be. The one little piece of evidence we have is in Wisconsin that turned out to be pretty good, even though they had to do it in the midst of this pandemic. I don't know if that was just people in poor areas showing up in big numbers, or if that was just big turnout in sort of highly educated areas, people that are already pretty politically adept anyway. So it's a bit of a dodge, but again, it remains to be seen. I think the one thing that it certainly hasn't done anything to dim the fervor within the Democratic Party to move in a more left-wing direction. That's something that's definitely been going on for some time, and Democrats are sort of doubling down on calls for a more expansive social safety net going forward. So.
And the last question, and I just want to say that they were coming in fast and furiously, both privately on the chat and to everyone. So if we missed you, I'm so sorry. And I know Professor Klinkner will answer you when he can.
I'll try. I'll do my best to answer.
I know. Our last question from Hattie Hewitty.
Professor Klinkner.
Hi.
This is part politics, part economics, but in the long term, the public debt in the US is ballooning. How do you think the fiscal policy or the political talk about fiscal policy is going to change? Is it going to change spending, and more importantly, who is going to pay?
Yeah, good question. Well, certainly it's changed it. Like I said, 2 months ago, if you said we're going to start, as the memes say, making the money machine go burr, nobody expected that. And it goes to show that Congress in a crisis will spend money. I was just looking, if people want to make a comparison to World War II, in 1945, the government spent approximately 40% of GDP. Some estimates have it up to half. That would be the equivalent today of about $10 trillion. And Congress may end up doing that. I think, and, the question is that whatever it is that they end up spending, how do you pay for it? And traditionally in the United States, we've paid for it through taxation. I think one thing that may happen is you'll get a lot more talk about some form of value-added tax or national sales tax, because the advantage of those things is that they raise a lot of money. They can bring in a lot of revenue. The other thing is that even if you really, really maxed out tax rates on upper income earners, you just don't get that much more money. Even if we went up to, say, World War II levels of 70, 80, 90% rates on the very highest income earners, you don't get all that much money. And that's why you saw people like even Elizabeth Warren talking about a wealth tax, because even if you sort of maximize rates on people in the upper income levels, it just doesn't generate a huge amount of revenue. So I think we're going to get a lot more talk about the possibility of a national value-added tax or something like that going forward. But it took decades for the United States to spend down the debt it incurred in World War II. It really took them the better part of 40 or 50 years to bring those debts down to the levels that were there before not 40, 50 years, about 30 or 40 years that there were before the war. So this is something that, we're not going to fix in a year. We're not going to pay it off in a year. But over time, slowly, hopefully, they'll bring that down, and it won't, sort of be too much of an economic drag. But again, the economists say that there really isn't a lot of evidence. There's a dispute among economists on this, but that, for a country as wealthy and prosperous and politically stable as the United States, there doesn't seem to be any, long-term lasting economic damage from having high debt levels, as long as, those things remain in place. So I guess that's the last question. Thank you all for doing this. For those of you who are admitted students, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me via email. Hopefully you will be able to see each other on campus in the fall. Hopefully everything in the fall will go off as expected. But that will mean that I will be in Washington, D.C. running our D.C. program there. But to all of you, hopefully you'll be able to make it to campus, and you'll have a great semester and start at Hamilton. For everybody else, stay healthy and well and sane. And I'll do my best to try and answer these questions. So, all right.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Phil.
you.
And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Professor.
Yeah, thank you all for
Thanks
doing
so
this.
much.
Appreciate it. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Nancy, I'm going to, dropping out here. Nancy, I'm going to try and answer some of these questions if I can.
Okay, and Phil, I'll get the transcript and I can send them to you.
But the thing, well, how would I respond? I guess here's the question. How would I respond to them? Because they're not going to be looking at Zoom. I would have to email them, I guess.
I can figure it out. If you can respond to the chats, I can send the group.
Okay.
Okay. I'll figure that out. If you are going to take the time to answer the questions, we'll figure out how to connect you with the.
All right. I'll take a look at it and see. So,
okay. Awesome.
All right. Thanks. Hey, Will, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for doing
it. New York?
It's strange. It's a weird place. It feels like things have maybe turned a corner here a little bit, but
yeah. Only in the sense that the numbers aren't getting bad as fast as they were before.
Yeah,
but that's, the first sign of improvement. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're all Andrew Cuomo fans now. That's the other big difference.
It was one of my in-laws was asking this, and it was like, I went and looked. Andrew Cuomo was incredibly unpopular in February.
Yeah, he's in like 80% now. It's great.
Yeah.
We all still hate de Blasio though.
Yeah. He has not sort of covered himself in glory in this moment. So yeah, interesting. But how's Ben doing?